The massive space station called Unity Base floated in the darkness between stars, its lights twinkling like a small city. Ships from dozens of different worlds docked there every day, bringing aliens of all shapes and sizes together in one place. Some looked almost human, others were so strange that newcomers would stare with wide eyes. In the education wing of the station, young beings from across the galaxy attended classes together. The hallways buzzed with different languages and the sound of feet, claws, and tentacles moving across metal floors. It was supposed to be a symbol of peace and cooperation, but like any place where different groups mixed, there were problems. Xena was one of the quieter students. She belonged to a species called the Villani, who had smooth blue-gray skin and large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. What made Xena different from most students wasn't her alien appearance, though. She couldn't walk. Her legs had never worked properly since birth, so she moved around in a sleek floating chair that responded to her thoughts and gentle hand gestures. The chair was beautiful in its own way, made from some kind of alien metal that shifted colors slightly as it moved. It allowed Xena to glide smoothly through the corridors and even hover at different heights to reach high shelves or participate in activities with taller beings. But to some of the other students, it made her an easy target. Xena spent most of her free time in the station's vast library, a peaceful place with floating books and holographic displays. She was studying to become a doctor, fascinated by how different species healed and survived. The library was her safe space, where she could disappear into medical texts and research papers about xenobiology without worrying about the stares or whispered comments from other students. Several floors below in the maintenance sections, a different kind of person went about his daily work. Jake Thompson was a human in his early 40s, with calloused hands and tired eyes that had seen too much. He'd served in the last big war between Earth and a hostile alien alliance, fighting in battles that most people preferred to forget. Now he fixed pipes, repaired air recyclers, and kept the station's countless systems running smoothly. Jake walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a plasma blast that had nearly taken his leg off on some distant battlefield. His dark skin bore a few scars, and his graying hair was always cut short in military fashion. Most of the alien residents gave him plenty of space when they saw him coming. Humans had earned a reputation during the war, and not everyone was comfortable around them yet. The maintenance tunnels and service corridors were Jake's domain. He knew every pipe, every wire, every hidden passage in the massive station. It was honest work, and after years of violence he appreciated the simple satisfaction of fixing things instead of breaking them. He kept to himself, did his job, and tried not to think too much about the past. But Jake noticed things. When you worked in the background, invisible to most people, you saw how they really behaved when they thought no one was watching. He'd observed the casual cruelty that some of the privileged alien youth showed to those they considered beneath them. He'd seen how the station's security forces, made up mostly of different alien species, sometimes looked the other way when certain families' children misbehaved. The problem group called themselves the Pack, though they were more like a gang of spoiled bullies than anything resembling actual pack hunters. Their leader was a tall, snake-like creature named Vex from a species that prided itself on being cunning and ruthless in business. His family owned mining operations on several worlds, which meant he had money, influence, and the kind of protection that came with both. Following Vex were twin brothers from a warrior species, built like walking tanks with thick gray hide and small, mean eyes. They weren't particularly smart, but they were strong and enjoyed intimidating smaller beings. The fourth member was the most dangerous in some ways, a shapeshifter who could alter his appearance and often used this ability to spy on potential victims or frame others for the pack's misdeeds. These four had made a game of tormenting anyone they saw as weak or different. They'd trip smaller aliens in the corridors, steal belongings and hide them in hard-to-reach places, and spread nasty rumors about students who couldn't defend themselves. The station's authorities usually treated their behavior as young people being young people, especially when their wealthy families made generous donations to station operations. Xena had managed to avoid their attention for months by staying quiet and keeping to less crowded areas. But in a place like Unity Base you could only hide for so long. The trouble started on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the library's quiet study section. Xena had found her favorite spot near the back, where tall shelves created a cozy corner away from the main traffic. She'd been working on a complex research paper about cross-species medical treatments, her notes spread across a floating table while holographic displays showed detailed anatomy charts of different alien races. The steady hum of the library's systems and the soft glow of reading lights had a calming effect. After hours of intense study, Xena's large eyes had grown heavy, and she'd allowed herself to rest her head on her arms for just a moment. The exhaustion from staying up late the previous night caught up with her, and soon she was sleeping peacefully in her floating chair. That's when the pack found her. Vex had been prowling the library levels looking for entertainment. His cold reptilian eyes spotted Xena's distinctive blue-gray skin from across the reading area, and a cruel smile spread across his scaled features. He signaled silently to his companions, who were lurking near the entertainment section pretending to browse recreational materials. The twin brothers, Rock and Grum, lumbered over with surprising stealth for such large beings. The shapeshifter, who went by the name Flick, had already altered his appearance to look like a harmless student researcher, complete with fake study materials and a borrowed identity badge. "Look what we have here," Vex whispered, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. Sleeping Beauty and her fancy ride. The four of them gathered around Xena's peaceful form like predators circling prey. Her breathing was slow and even, one hand still clutching a stylus while the other rested near her chair's control panel. The floating chair itself hummed softly, its anti-gravity systems keeping it perfectly stable even while its occupants slept. Vex's plan was simple and cruel. "Let's see how well she gets around without her special transportation," he hissed quietly to the others. Flick kept watch while the twins did the heavy work. They were surprisingly gentle as they lifted Xena from her chair, their warrior species strength allowing them to move her sleeping form without waking her. They carefully placed her on a nearby reading couch, arranging her position so she looked like any other student taking a nap between study sessions. The floating chair, now empty, bobbed slightly in the air as Rock grabbed its control handles. The sophisticated piece of technology responded to his touch, though clumsily since it wasn't calibrated for his alien physiology. Grum helped guide it as they maneuvered the chair away from the study area, their movements careful to avoid security cameras and other students. They took it 3 levels down to a maintenance storage area that Flick had scouted earlier. The shapeshifter had noticed that this particular closet was rarely used and had faulty lighting that created perfect shadows for hiding things. They pushed the chair deep into the back corner, behind stacks of cleaning supplies and old equipment parts. "She'll never find it here," Rock rumbled with satisfaction, his thick fingers drumming against his leg. "And even if she does, imagine how much fun she'll have getting to it," Vex added, his voice dripping with malicious amusement. Back in the library, Xena stirred awake as the afternoon shift change brought new sounds echoing through the corridors. For a moment she felt disoriented, unsure why she was lying on a couch instead of sitting in her chair. Then the horrible realization hit her like a physical blow. Her chair was gone. Panic rose in her throat as she pushed herself up on her arms, looking around desperately. The reading area was mostly empty now, just a few serious students absorbed in their work. No one seemed to have noticed anything unusual. "Help!" Xena called out, her voice barely above a whisper at first. Then louder, "Help! Someone took my chair." A Centaurian student with 4 arms looked up from his holographic textbook, his face showing confusion and then uncomfortable pity. He glanced around nervously before quickly gathering his materials and leaving, clearly not wanting to get involved. An elderly librarian, a kindly being from a species that looked like walking trees, shuffled over with concern written across her bark-like features. "What's wrong, dear?" "My mobility chair," Xena explained, fighting back tears. "I fell asleep and now it's gone. I can't move without it." The librarian's branch-like fingers touched Xena's shoulder gently. "Oh my. Let me contact security right away." It took 20 minutes for Officer Thane to arrive, a bored-looking member of the Altarian security force. His blue uniform was slightly wrinkled, and he carried himself with the attitude of someone who dealt with minor student complaints all day long. "So you're saying someone took your chair while you were sleeping?" he asked, pulling out a small recording device. "Yes," Xena replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "It's a specialized mobility device. I need it to move around the station." Officer Thane looked around the library with disinterested eyes. "Any witnesses? Security footage of the perpetrators?" The librarian shook her head sadly. "The cameras in this section have been malfunctioning for weeks. We've requested repairs but—" "Right," Thane said, making a brief note. "Look, miss, this kind of thing happens with young people. Probably just a prank that got out of hand. I'm sure whoever took it will bring it back once they've had their fun." Xena stared at him in disbelief. "A prank? Officer, without my chair I can't get to classes, can't reach my quarters, can't even get to the dining areas. This isn't funny." "I understand your frustration," Thane replied in a tone that suggested he didn't understand at all. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out for it. These things usually turn up within a day or 2. After the officer left, Xena was alone with the devastating reality of her situation. The reading couch was comfortable, but it was also a prison. She could drag herself across the floor using her arms, but the distances in the massive station were enormous. Even getting back to her quarters would take hours of painful crawling. She began the humiliating journey anyway, pulling herself down from the couch onto the cold metal floor. Other students and station residents saw her struggling along the corridors, but most looked away quickly, uncomfortable with witnessing her degradation. That's when Jake saw her. He was returning from a repair job in the upper levels when he spotted movement near the floor in one of the main corridors. At first, he thought someone had dropped something, but then he realized what he was actually seeing. A young alien girl, dragging herself across the station floor with quiet dignity, her legs trailing uselessly behind her. Around her, other beings hurried past with averted eyes, pretending not to see her struggle. Something cold and hard settled in Jake's chest as he watched. He'd seen enough cruelty in the war to recognize it in peacetime, and this had all the hallmarks of deliberate malice. Someone had done this to her on purpose. And nobody seemed to care enough to do anything about it. Jake didn't approach Xena that first day. Something inside him burned like acid watching her struggle, but he knew that rushing over might embarrass her even more. The girl had pride and he respected that. Instead, he made a mental note of exactly where and when he'd seen her, then quietly followed at a distance to make sure she reached safety. It took Xena almost 2 hours to drag herself back to her quarters. By the time she reached her door, her arms were shaking with exhaustion and her palms were scraped raw from the rough metal flooring. Jake watched from a maintenance alcove as she finally made it inside, then he turned and walked away with murder in his eyes. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Xena's face, the way she'd kept her chin up even while pulling herself along the floor like a wounded animal. It reminded him too much of his war buddies who'd been left behind, of promises broken by people who were supposed to care. By morning, Jake had made his decision. If the station's official security wouldn't help, then he'd handle this the way he'd learned to handle problems during the war. Quietly, thoroughly, and with extreme prejudice. The maintenance tunnels gave Jake access to places most people never knew existed. Over his 3 years working on Unity Base, he'd memorized every camera angle, every blind spot, every service corridor that ran behind the main areas. More importantly, he had access to the station's computer systems through his work terminals. Jake started by pulling up the security footage from around the time Xena had been targeted. The cameras in the library study section were indeed broken, but the corridors leading to that area weren't. It took him 6 hours of careful review, but eventually he spotted them, 4 figures moving together with suspicious purpose, one of them guiding what looked like Xena's floating chair. The shapeshifter had been clever, altering his appearance, but Jake had been trained to spot deception. Military intelligence had taught him to look for behavioral patterns rather than just physical features. The way the creature moved, the slight delay in his reactions, it screamed fake to anyone who knew what to watch for. Identifying the others was easier. The twin giants were hard to miss, and the snake-like leader had a distinctive walking pattern that showed up clearly on the recordings. Jake cross-referenced their movements with the station's resident database, using his maintenance access to pull up living quarters, family information, and daily schedules. Vex Silthar, mining family from Kepler Prime, Jake muttered as he read the files. Rock and Grum Thornback, warrior caste from the Titan worlds. And Flick Morphos, diplomatic family from the Changing Worlds. All of them had wealthy, influential parents. All of them had previous complaints filed against them that had mysteriously disappeared from official records. All of them thought they were untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Jake spent the next 2 days mapping out their routines. Vex usually spent his afternoons in the luxury recreation areas, playing games that cost more than most people earned in a month. The Thornback twins hung around the fighting simulators, bullying smaller beings into unfair matches. Flick moved around more, but he had a pattern. He always visited the observation decks during the evening shift change to watch the ships come and go. On the 3rd day, Jake made his first move. He found Xena's chair exactly where he'd expected, hidden in a storage closet 3 levels down from the library. The sophisticated piece of technology was undamaged but had been carelessly shoved behind cleaning supplies. Jake carefully extracted it, checking every system to make sure it was working properly. Instead of returning it directly to Xena, Jake decided on something more subtle. That evening, he waited until she was asleep, then used his maintenance access to enter the residential area. He placed the chair right outside her quarters with a simple handwritten note. "This belongs to you. A friend." The next morning, Jake positioned himself where he could watch Xena discover her chair. The relief and joy on her face when she saw it was worth all the risk he was taking. She looked around carefully, probably wondering who had returned it, but Jake remained hidden in the shadows. But finding the chair was just the beginning. Jake had spent years learning that some people only understood one kind of language, and it wasn't the polite kind that station security preferred to speak. He started gathering intelligence on his targets with the same systematic approach he'd used during wartime operations. Vex had a weakness for expensive alien liquors and often drank alone in his family's private suite. The Thornback twins were strong but stupid, relying on intimidation rather than actual fighting skill. Flick was clever but overconfident, believing his shape-shifting abilities made him invisible. Jake began preparing. He retrieved certain items from his personal storage locker, things he'd hoped never to use again. A few medical supplies, some restraint equipment, and tools that could cause very specific types of damage without being lethal. He'd learned precision during the war, the difference between teaching a lesson and committing murder. The station's layout worked in his favor. There were hundreds of isolated spots where someone could have a private conversation without interruption. Maintenance areas, cargo holds, emergency shelters that hadn't been used in years. Jake scouted them all, looking for places where screaming wouldn't carry and security cameras couldn't see. He also started watching the pack's behavior more closely. They were getting bolder, probably thinking they'd gotten away with their prank completely. Jake saw them trip a young Centaurian in the dining hall, causing him to spill food all over himself while they laughed. He watched them corner a nervous-looking student from a peaceful species and demand his homework assignments. Each incident Jake witnessed added fuel to the cold fire burning in his chest. These weren't kids making mistakes. They were predators who'd learned that the system would protect them no matter what they did. Someone needed to teach them that protection had limits. On the 5th day after returning Xena's chair, Jake made his final preparations. He wrote a simple message to his supervisor, explaining that he might be unavailable for a few days due to a personal matter. He organized his tools and made sure his quarters were clean and organized old military habits that never really went away. That evening, as the station settled into its night cycle, Jake Thompson went hunting. The pack had no idea that a human veteran with nothing left to lose had decided they needed to learn about consequences. Jake's first target was Rock, the larger of the twin brothers. The massive alien had a predictable routine. Every night after the dining halls closed, he would take a detour through the lower cargo areas to intimidate the night shift workers and steal small items just because he could. Jake waited in Cargo Bay 7, a dimly lit space filled with shipping containers from various worlds. The smell of exotic spices and industrial lubricants hung in the recycled air. When Rock's heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor, Jake stepped out from behind a stack of metal crates. "Evening," Jake said quietly, his hands empty but ready. Rock turned, his small eyes squinting in the poor lighting. The alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick gray hide that could probably stop small weapons fire. He was used to smaller beings running away when they saw him coming. "What do you want, human?" Rock rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "This area is off-limits to maintenance during night shift." "I want to talk about a girl's wheelchair," Jake replied, not moving closer but not backing away either. "Blue-skinned student. You might remember taking it as a joke." Rock's expression shifted from confusion to cruel amusement. "All that. What about it? We returned it, didn't we? No harm done." "See, that's where you're wrong," Jake said, his voice still calm. "There was plenty of harm. You just didn't care enough to notice." The alien took a threatening step forward, using his size to intimidate like he always did. "Listen, little human. You don't want trouble with me. I can break you in half without even trying." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "But you'd have to catch me first." What happened next took exactly 43 seconds. Rock charged forward with the confidence of someone who'd never met real resistance. Jake sidestepped smoothly, letting the alien's own momentum carry him past. As Rock stumbled, Jake grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby tool cart and struck precisely at the back of the alien's knee joint. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the cargo bay as Rock went down hard. Before he could recover, Jake was already moving, applying the same precise strike to the other leg. The alien's screams bounced off the metal walls, but the cargo bay was soundproofed for loading operations. "You took away her ability to move," Jake said, standing over the writhing form. "Now you know how that feels." He left Rock there, knowing the alien's own emergency beacon would eventually bring medical help. The injuries were severe but not life-threatening, both legs broken in places that would heal properly with treatment, but would take months of painful recovery. Grum, the second twin, fell 2 nights later in a maintenance tunnel. He'd been stalking a small, bird-like alien student when Jake intercepted him. This time the confrontation was even shorter. Grum was expecting his brother to back him up, not knowing that Rock was still in the medical bay under heavy sedation. Jake used the confined space to his advantage, making it impossible for the larger alien to use his strength effectively. The result was the same: 2 precisely broken legs and a very clear message about what happened to bullies who picked on the defenseless. Flick proved more challenging because of his shape-shifting abilities. The creature could look like anyone, making him nearly impossible to track through normal means. But Jake had learned patience during long reconnaissance missions in the war, and he knew that even the cleverest enemy had patterns. Flick's weakness was his ego. He couldn't resist showing off his abilities, often shifting into the forms of attractive aliens to get closer to potential victims or to spy on conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. Jake figured out that the shapeshifter had a favorite observation point, a rarely used maintenance balcony overlooking the main plaza where he could watch the daily activities and plan his next bit of mischief. Jake waited 3 nights before Flick appeared, wearing the form of a popular Centaurian singer that many students admired. The disguise was nearly perfect, but Jake had studied the real singer's movements from security footage. Flick held himself slightly wrong, moved a fraction too carefully. "Nice evening for watching people," Jake commented, stepping out onto the balcony. Flick spun around, already shifting back to his natural form, a lean gray-skinned being with large black eyes. "Who are you?" "This area is restricted." "I'm the guy who's been looking for you," Jake replied. "We need to discuss your recent pranks." Unlike the twins, Flick was quick and smart. He immediately tried to shift into Jake's own form, thinking it would confuse the human. But Jake had expected this trick and had come prepared with a small device that emitted a specific frequency of light. The shifting process required concentration, and the strobing light disrupted Flick's ability to maintain false shapes. "Clever," Flick gasped, stuck halfway between forms. "But you're just one human. I can outlast you." "Maybe," Jake said, pulling out restraints designed for shapeshifters. "But you can't outrun me with broken legs." The confrontation lasted longer than the others because Flick kept trying to escape, but the outcome was inevitable. Jake had fought enemies much more dangerous than one spoiled alien teenager who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. When it was over, Flick lay unconscious on the balcony floor, both legs fractured in the same precise manner as his friends. Jake left him with his emergency beacon activated and a simple message: "This is what happens when you hurt people who can't fight back." By now, word was spreading through the station about the mysterious attacks on the pack members. Security was investigating, but they had no real leads. The attacks had happened in places with no working cameras, and the victims' stories kept changing. Flick claimed he'd been attacked by multiple assailants. The twins insisted their attacker had been at least 10 feet tall. Jake's final target was Vex, the leader who'd thought up the original prank. The snake-like alien had gone into hiding after his friends were found, staying in his family's luxury quarters and demanding extra security. But money couldn't buy protection from someone who knew every secret passage in the station. Jake had saved Vex for last because he wanted the alien to understand exactly what was coming. Fear was an excellent teacher, and Vex had plenty of time to think about his actions while his friends screamed in medical bay. When Jake finally cornered him in the private dining room of the Siltar family suite, Vex was ready with offers of money, threats about his family's influence, and promises that he'd learned his lesson. "You don't understand," Vex hissed, his forked tongue flicking nervously. "My family owns mining operations on 6 worlds. They have contracts with the station authority. You can't just—" "I can," Jake interrupted quietly. "And I will." What followed wasn't just justice, it was a lesson that would echo through the station for years to come. When station security finally found Vex 3 hours later, he was alive but fundamentally changed. Like his friends, he would spend months learning to walk again. But unlike his friends, Vex would never forget the human who taught him that some lines should never be crossed, no matter how much money or influence you had. The pack was finished, broken in every sense of the word. Jake knew they would come for him eventually. After 4 members of the most influential families on the station ended up in medical bay with identical injuries, even the laziest security officer could connect the dots. He didn't try to hide or run. Instead, he went about his normal maintenance duties, fixing air recyclers and cleaning water filters like nothing had happened. The arrest came on a Thursday morning while Jake was replacing a faulty power coupling in Section 12. Commander Stone herself led the security team, her blue uniform crisp and her expression deadly serious. She was a Rigelian, tall and elegant with silver skin and eyes that missed nothing. "Jake Thompson," she announced formally. "You're under arrest for assault and battery on 4 individuals." Jake set down his tools carefully, wiped his hands on his work coveralls, and held out his wrists for the restraints. "Yes, ma'am. I've been expecting you." The security team seemed surprised by his calm cooperation. They'd probably prepared for a fight or at least some kind of resistance. Instead, Jake walked quietly between them to the security station, nodding politely to other workers they passed in the corridors. The interrogation room was small and sterile, with recording devices built into the walls and a single table bolted to the floor. Commander Stone sat across from Jake, her silver fingers drumming silently on the metal surface. "You broke the legs of 4 young beings," she began without preamble. "They're all in serious condition. 2 needed surgery. 1 may never walk normally again." Jake nodded once. "That was intentional, ma'am?" Stone leaned back in her chair, studying the human's scarred face. "No remorse? No explanation about how it was self-defense or they attacked you first?" "No, ma'am," Jake replied quietly. "They got exactly what I intended them to get. This is vigilante justice, Thompson. We have laws here. Due process. Courts and judges to determine guilt and punishment." Jake's dark eyes met hers steadily. "You had those same laws when they took that girl's wheelchair. Didn't seem to help much then." The commander's expression tightened. "That was investigated. Officer Thane filed a report. These things happen with young people. Pranks that go too far." "And what was the result of that investigation?" Jake asked. "What consequences did they face for leaving a disabled girl stranded and humiliated?" Stone was quiet for a long moment. They both knew the answer. Nothing. The pack had faced no consequences at all except for a brief conversation with a board security officer who treated the whole thing like a minor inconvenience. "That doesn't justify what you did," Stone said finally. "You can't just decide to be judge, jury, and executioner because you don't like how we handle things." Jake leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Commander, I spent 5 years fighting in the Centauri War. I saw what happens when good people stand by and do nothing while the strong prey on the weak. I made a promise to myself that I'd never let that happen again, not where I could stop it." "So you appointed yourself protector of the station?" "I appointed myself protector of one scared girl who nobody else seemed to care about." Jake's hands remained steady on the table. "Those 4 learned a lesson about consequences. The kind their money and family influence had protected them from their whole lives." Stone activated a recording device. "Let me understand this clearly. You systematically hunted down and assaulted 4 juveniles in premeditated attacks. You used your knowledge of the station's layout and your access to restricted areas to corner them when they couldn't escape or call for help. Is this accurate?" "Yes, ma'am, that's accurate." "And you feel no remorse for putting them in medical bay?" Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I feel sorry that it was necessary. I feel sorry that they'd never learned basic decency from their families or their schools. But remorse for stopping bullies who were hurting innocent people? No, ma'am, I don't feel any remorse for that." The news of Jake's arrest spread through Unity Base like wildfire. The alien families demanded maximum punishment, calling for him to be sent to the harshest prison colony they could find. Their lawyers arrived from across the galaxy, filing lawsuits and demanding compensation for their children's pain and suffering. But something unexpected happened as the story spread. Other voices began to speak up. Students who'd been terrorized by the pack started sharing their own experiences. Workers who'd been intimidated and robbed came forward with stories they'd never reported because they knew nothing would be done. Even some of the station staff admitted they'd looked the other way when the 4 bullies had caused trouble, afraid of the political consequences of confronting such influential families. Xena herself became the center of attention she'd never wanted. News reporters from dozens of worlds wanted to interview her, to hear about the prank that had triggered such dramatic consequences. She spoke quietly but firmly about what it had felt like to be stranded, to drag herself across the station floor while people looked away in embarrassment. "He gave me back more than my chair," she told one persistent reporter. "He gave me back my dignity. He showed me that someone cared enough to act when nobody else would." The trial was broadcast across the galaxy, becoming a symbol of something larger than one man's vigilante justice. Humans had always been seen as somewhat dangerous by other species, but this case highlighted something different: their willingness to fight for others, even strangers, even aliens they barely knew. Jake's lawyer argued that he'd acted to protect a vulnerable individual when the system had failed completely. The prosecution countered that vigilante justice couldn't be tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. Expert witnesses debated human psychology, discussing the species' unusual tendency to form protective bonds with beings outside their own kind. In the end, Jake was sentenced to 5 years in a minimum security facility, with the possibility of early release for good behavior. The judge, an elderly being from a species known for their wisdom, made it clear that while Jake's methods were wrong, his motivations were understandable given the complete failure of official channels to address the problem. As Jake was led away in restraints, Xena was waiting in the corridor outside the courtroom. She positioned her floating chair directly in his path, forcing the security escort to stop. "Thank you," she said simply, her large eyes bright with unshed tears. Jake nodded once. "Take care of yourself, miss. And remember, you're stronger than you think." The transport ship that carried Jake to his prison was filled with mixed emotions. Some passengers and crew members looked at him like a dangerous criminal. Others nodded with respect, understanding that sometimes doing the right thing required breaking the wrong rules. As Unity Base disappeared behind them, Jake looked out the small porthole at the stars beyond. Somewhere back on that station, Xena was continuing her medical studies, probably becoming the doctor she'd always dreamed of being. The pack members were learning to walk again, hopefully gaining some wisdom along with their physical therapy. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone saw a vulnerable person being hurt, they'd remember that doing nothing was also a choice, one that a human veteran had shown them didn't have to be the only option. The galaxy had learned something about humanity that day. They were dangerous, yes. But they were most dangerous when fighting for someone who couldn't fight for themselves.